Hello and welcome to this second part of the lectures on processing of a textile fabric on a Stenter. So in this second part of this lecture series on processing of a fabric on a Stenter, we are going to specifically focus on two aspects. The first one is how we control the lengthwise tension in the fabric when it is being processed on a Stenter. The technical terms for controlling the lengthwise tension are called overfeeding or underfeeding. The second thing that we will be covering in this lecture is the mechanisms that are involved to ensure that fabric selvages are properly secured in the Stenter chains as it is carried through the machine. So let's look at the fabric feeding mechanism. This is the first part in the actual Stenter frame, and it's responsible for forwarding the fabric in a very controlled manner. So let's quickly recall that in a Stenter, we only hold the fabric selvages in chains, and this is how the fabric is carried through the treatment chambers. So the role of the feeding mechanism in this Stenter is to ensure two things. Firstly, the feeding mechanism should be able to feed the fabric or forward the fabric to the Stenter chains with the required tension. So whether we want to excessively feed the fabric to the Stenter chains, that is, if we want to reduce the lengthwise tension, or if we want to feed less fabric, that is underfeeding, then the feeding device should be able to do that as well in a very controlled manner. So this action is controlled by the feeding device on the Stenter. The second thing that the feeding mechanism has to achieve is to ensure that fabric selvages are properly gripped at all times. Because if the fabric selvages are not held properly, then the fabric will be damaged in the machine as it goes through the treatment chambers. And this is done with the help of gliding mechanism. So in summary, we can say that the fabric feeding mechanism in a Stenter consists of a feeding device which controls the lengthwise tension in the fabric, and a gliding mechanism which ensures that fabric selvages are held properly at all times. So let's look at the first component of the fabric feeding mechanism. The first component is the feeding device, and it is the component of the Stenter or component of the overall feeding mechanism which precisely controls the amount of fabric that is forwarded to the subsequent sections of the Stenter. So basically, this is the point where we control the lengthwise tension in the fabric very precisely. As far as the construction of the feeding device is concerned, it's not very complicated. Essentially, it consists of one or more motor-driven rollers with a rubberized surface, and these rollers have a rubberized surface because, as you would have understood already, we need a very proper grip on the fabric so that the amount of fabric that we are forwarding to the subsequent sections is precisely controlled. So let's look at where it is located and how does it look like. So if you look at the entry section of a Stenter frame, this part over here that you can see is the fabric feeding device. And if you look at the internal structure of this, then it consists of this box is the feeding device, and the rest of it is a separate device which we will talk about in a while. And the two rollers that you see with their shafts marked in black and white are the rubberized driven rollers. These rollers control the amount of fabric. They precisely control the amount of fabric that is forwarded to the subsequent sections of the machine. And then the other rollers that you see here, the unmarked ones, are the simple guide rollers as you would expect in any open width continuous processing machine. Now let's see how the lengthwise tension in the fabric is controlled with the help of feeding device. So first of all, there are two conditions that we can achieve here. The first one is what we call the overfed condition. So overfed condition is one in which excess amount of fabric is passed on by the feeding device to the Stenter chains. And as you would expect, this results in a situation where the fabric is relaxed in the lengthwise or warpwise direction. This is done if we are required to stretch the fabric widthwise. So basically, at the expense of the length of the fabric, we gain width of the fabric. Again, how much do you want to overfeed? Depends on what are the requirements in the final fabric. Let's look at how it is done with the help of diagrams. So as you can hopefully recognize the feeding device here, the feeding device will forward an excess amount of fabric And the subsequent device, which is called the Stenter chain, they take up less fabric. So as you would expect, the lengthwise tension is then reduced in the fabric. The other condition that you can maintain or achieve with the help of feeding device is what we call the underfed condition. And this is just the exact opposite of the overfed condition. So in the underfed condition, the feeding device forwards a less amount of fabric to the Stenter chains. So the fabric is stretched or it's under tension in the lengthwise direction. And this is the condition which is again maintained according to what we require in the fabric. And if we are maintaining the underfed condition, then at the end of the processing of fabric on a Stenter, we will have more fabric lengthwise than we actually fed. So basically, in simple words, the fabric gets stretched in the lengthwise direction. Let's look at how it is done with the help of a diagram. So again, you can see the feeding mechanism. So the feeding mechanism will forward less amount of fabric, and the speed of the Stenter chains will be slightly more than the speed at which fabric is forwarded by the feeding device. And this results in lengthwise tension in the fabric. Now, when a fabric is processed on the Stenter, the percentage of overfed fabric or the percentage of the underfed fabric is sort of calculated and precisely controlled. So we sort of give this input into the machine controls that what's the percentage of overfed that we need, or what is the percentage of the underfed that we need, and the machine drives the speed of the fabric feeding device, and the speed of the Stenter chains is automatically adjusted then. Let's look at the second component of the fabric feeding mechanism on a Stenter, that is called the gliding mechanism. So gliding mechanism is positioned at the entry of the treatment chambers. And if we again look at the layout, this is where the gliding mechanism is. So the purpose of the gliding mechanism is to constantly align the Stenter chains that are taking the fabric from the feeding device, so that the Stenter chains are always perfectly aligned with the selvedges of the incoming fabric. And that is crucial because the fabric selvedges have to be secured properly. So essentially, the gliding mechanism consists of two swiveling arms that catch the fabric selvedges. So we have these two long sort of arm type devices sticking out of the treatment chambers, and they are automatically moved left or right as the fabric selvages are detected. So at all times, the automated system makes sure that these arms are always aligned with the fabric selvages. So let's look at the gliding mechanism in action. In this video, you will only see one of the gliding arms. In the previous slide, you have seen that the gliding mechanism consists of two arms. But for the sake of clarity, I have focused only on one side of the gliding mechanism. So as the fabric is being fed from the infeed zone, it could shift from left to right. But this can become a serious problem in a Stenter because we only want to secure the selvages of the fabric, and the fabric is not passing over any rollers. So as the fabric shifts left or right, the gliding arms also move. If you look closely, you probably have already noticed that the gliding arm, which is sticking out of the treatment chamber, is gradually shifting towards the right side of the machine. And this must be because, as mentioned earlier, the fabric which is coming in from the infeed zone, or which is being passed on to the next section by the infeed zone, is shifting towards the right hand side. So with the help of sensors, the whole gliding arm is shifted such that the Stenter chain is always in perfect alignment with the fabric selvages. So let's look at the working of gliding mechanism in a bit more detail with the help of a few schematics. So here is another top view of a Stenter schematic, and we have the gliding arms sticking out of the treatment chambers and the Stenter chain running on the gliding arms. So optical or mechanical sensors can be used to detect the position of the incoming salvages, and these are the sensors that we are referring to. So right at the entry of the gliding arms, there are sensors which detect the fabric salvages. And the signal from these sensors is of course processed, and the gliding arms are moved with the help of actuators to ensure that they are properly aligned with the fabric selvages. So the gliding arms can swivel left to right according to the position of the fabric. The gap between the gliding arms also has to be maintained accurately. So in this image that you can see on the bottom left corner of the slide, if you look closely, you will observe that the gap between the gliding arms is slightly more than the fabric width. This is an incorrect configuration of the gliding arms, and if this happens, then probably the fabric salvages will not be gripped and the fabric will be damaged. If you look at the second image, then the gap between the gliding arms is slightly less than the fabric width. This is again an incorrect configuration for the gliding arms, and it will result in fabric damage. In the third image that you can see here, the gap between the gliding arms is exactly equal to the fabric width, and this is what has to be maintained at all times. So this is the right configuration or right adjustment of the gliding arms, which should be done automatically by the sensors and the actuators. So up till now, you have seen that the entire purpose of the gliding mechanism is to ensure that fabric salvages are secured properly. But what if the fabric salvages are not detected properly? And that's why it is very important that for proper working of the gliding mechanism, any folds or creases in the salvages are removed before the salvages are detected. Otherwise, incorrect position of the salvages will be detected and the gliding arm will then grip onto an unnecessary part of the fabric. To achieve complete and perfect uncurling of the fabric salvages, there are devices that we call selvage uncurlers that are mounted right at the entry of the gliding mechanism.
As the name implies, selvage uncurlers removed any curls or folds from the selvages, and they are of different types. The first type is that of uh, is the type known as the mechanical selvage uncurlers. These are very similar to spreader rollers. If you recall your previous courses in which you have studied any open width continuous processing machine, then you will recall spreader rollers as well. These are the rollers which have screw type threading on their surface, and these are motor driven. So due to this outward threading on the surface, these spreader rollers remove any creases from the fabric. In case of a mechanical selvage uncurler, the structure is very similar. So a mechanical selvage uncurler consists of these motor driven spindles. These spindles have the screw type threading on their surface to remove creases from the selvages. So this assembly over here, as you can see, it's mounted on the gliding arm. This whole set of parts, that's the selvage uncurler, and here is a clear, much clearer view of how it looks like. So as you can see, these are the motor driven spindles. You can see these have these screw type threadings on them. So of course, when the fabric passes over these spindles, they remove any creases from the selvages. So the number of spindles in a mechanical selvage uncurler depend on the type of the fabric. So in the mechanical selvage uncurler that you see here, there are 4 spindles, but there can be like more than 4 as well, or less than 4. The other type of selvage uncurler is called a pneumatic selvage uncurler. And pneumatic selvage uncurler removes any folds or creases in the selvages by blowing high pressure air on the selvages. This type of selvage uncurler is usually considered more suitable for very smooth fabrics, because a very smooth fabric will have a tendency to slip through the spindles of a mechanical salvage uncurler, and in that case the spindles of a mechanical salvage uncurler might not be able to remove the creases or folds in the salvages just because the fabric is too slippery or too smooth. That's where we use a pneumatic selvage uncurler. So that's the structure of a pneumatic selvage uncurler. It's actually only this plate over here, which is a pneumatic selvage uncurler. The other parts that you see in the image are the components of the gliding mechanism. So a closer look. This plate consists of these nozzles. You can see these nozzles over here, from which high pressure air is blown onto the fabric selvages, and so the creases are removed. The third type of selvage uncurlers is just simply a set of fixed plates that are made of plastic material such as nylon or any other low friction material. These fixed plates have slanted protrusions over which the fabric runs, and due to the angle of the protrusions, any folds or creases in the selvages are removed. This is how it looks like. So we are talking about these these protrusions over here. You can see their angle. The fabric is positioned like this. So that's the fabrics. So of course, if let's say the fabric is traveling in this direction, then just totally on the basis of friction exerted by these slanted protrusions, any folds or creases in the selvages are removed in this direction, in the outward direction, if you like. Yes, this is how the fabric is passed through the plates. So it's like a sandwiched structure. We have a bottom plate, this one over here, and a top plate. Both have these protrusions over them, and the fabric is traveling in this direction. So you can imagine that if there is any fold or crease, then due to the friction and the angle of these protrusions, that fold or crease will be removed in the outward direction. So that's the third type of salvage uncurler. If we want to compare the three types of salvage uncurlers, then we can compare them on the basis of their effectiveness in removing creases from the fabric. We can compare them on the basis of consumption of utilities, let's say. So if we talk about the effectiveness of these different types of salvage uncurlers, then it's not that one of these is more effective than the other. It's just that the selection of the type of salvage uncurler depends on the type of the fabric. If you are processing very heavy qualities, very heavy fabric, then you will prefer to use the mechanical salvage uncurlers because those have those motor driven spindles, and thus they are very effective in removal of creases. In a way, you can ensure that on a mechanical salvage uncurler, any creases or folds in the salvages are removed. But then those mechanical salvage uncurlers might not work that effectively if the fabric is very smooth, and that's where a pneumatic salvage uncurler comes in. So a pneumatic salvage uncurler will require uh, pressurized air systems, of course, for its working. So that could be one consideration. As far as these fixed plates are concerned, these are better in a sense that these plates do not require any electricity consumption. There are no motors there. There is no air pressure system involved here. But then, of course, the effectiveness is, I mean, questionable. You have to be very careful when you are using these plates, and you have to ensure that the fabric qualities that you are processing can be handled in the presence of this type of salvage and curler. Okay, that was all about the salvage and curlers. If I summarize the purpose, then we are still talking about the gliding mechanism of a stenter. We discussed that gliding mechanism ensures that fabric salvages are secured properly in the stenter chains. We discussed that proper working of gliding mechanism is depending on proper detection of the salvages, and therefore we use these salvage uncurlers right at this at the entry of the gliding mechanism. And then there are three types of the salvage uncurlers. Okay, as I mentioned, there are no moving parts in this type of salvage and curler in the fixed plates, so they are in a way easy to maintain. But by time, these protrusions will wear off, and you have to replace these plates. However, there is no electricity consumption, and as such, no routine maintenance required for these fixed plates. As I just discussed, the effectiveness can be questionable.
So let's look at a summary of this lecture. All we have discussed in this lecture is that before the fabric is passed on to the treatment chambers, its selvages are secured properly. This is done with the help of gliding mechanism which is mounted at the entry of the treatment chambers. Gliding mechanism is automatically aligned with the fabric selvages with the help of sensors that detect the fabric selvages, and devices like selvage uncurlers make sure that fabric selvages are perfectly straight and therefore the correct edge of the selvage is detected. Thank you for listening to this lecture, and in the next part we will talk in more detail about the gripping elements that actually hold the fabric, and we will also talk about how width adjustment is actually done and the calculations related to that.